Hey guys, welcome to the third part of the reading of George MacDonald's fairy tale, Cross Purposes. Hope you guys have enjoyed the first two videos, and if not, I don't know why you're here, so check out the first two videos. Cross Purposes. When he woke, he found himself still afloat upon a broad palm leaf. He was alone in the middle of a lake, with flowers and trees growing in and out of everywhere. The sun was just over the treetops. A drip of water from the flowers greeted him with music, and mists were dissolving away. And where the sunlight fell on the lake, the water was clear as glass. Casting his eyes downward, he saw just beneath him, far down at the bottom, Alice, drowned, as he thought. He was in the act of plunging in when he saw her open her eyes and at the same time begin to float up. He held out his hand, but she repelled it with disdain, and swimming to a tree, sat down on a low branch, wondering how ever the poor widow's son could have found his way into fairyland. She did not like it. It was an invasion of privilege. "How did you come here, young Richard?" she asked, with 6 yards off. "A goblin brought me." "Ah, thought so. A fairy brought me." "Where is your fairy?" "Here I am," said Peas Blossom, rising slowly to the surface just by the tree on which Alice was seated. "Where's your goblin?" retorted Alice. "Here I am," bawled Toadstool, rushing out of the water like a salmon and casting a somersault in the air before he fell in again with a tremendous splash. His head rose again close beside Peas Blossom, who, being so used to creatures, only laughed. "Isn't he handsome?" he grinned. "Yes, very. He wants polishing, though." "You could do that for yourself, you know. Shall we change?" "I don't mind. You'll find her rather silly." "That's nothing. The boy's too sensible for me." He dived and rose at Alice's feet. She shrieked with terror. The fairy floated away like a water lily towards Richard. "What a lovely creature," thought he, but hearing Alice's shriek again, he said, "Don't leave Alice. She's frightened at that queer creature. I don't think there's any harm in him, though, Alice." "Oh, no, he won't hurt her," said Peas Blossom. "I'm tired of her. He's going to take her to the court, and I'll take you." "I don't want to go." "But you must. You can't go home. You don't know the way." "Richard, Richard!" cried Alice in agony. Richard sprang from his boat and was by her side in a moment. "He pinched me," cried Alice. Richard hit the goblin a terrible blow on the head, but it took no more effect on him than as if his head had been a round ball of Indian rubber. He gave Richard a furious look, however, and bawling out, "You'll repent that," vanished under the water. "Come along, Richard. Make haste. He will murder you," cried the fairy. "It's all your fault," said Richard. "I won't leave Alice." Then the fairy saw it was all over with her and Toadstool, for they can do nothing with mortals against their will. So she floated away across the water in Richard's boat, holding her robe for a sail, and vanished, leaving the two alone in the lake. "You have driven away my fairy," cried Alice. "I shall never get home now. It's all your fault, you naughty young man." "I drove away the goblin," remonstrated Richard. "Will you please to sit on the other side of the tree? I wonder what my papa would say if he saw me talking to you." "Will you come to the next tree, Alice?" said Richard after a pause. Alice, who had been crying all the time that Richard was thinking, said, "I won't." Richard therefore plunged into the water without her and swam for the tree. Before he had got halfway, however, he heard Alice crying, "Richard, Richard!" This was just what he wanted. So he turned back, and Alice threw herself into the water. With Richard's help, she swam pretty well, and they reached the tree. "Now for the next," said Richard, and they swam to the next and then to the third. Every tree they reached was larger than the last, and every tree before them was larger still. So they swam from tree to tree, till they came to one that was so large they could not see round it. What was to be done? Clearly, to climb this tree. It was a dreadful prospect for Alice, but Richard proceeded to climb, and by putting her feet where he put his, and now and then getting hold of his ankle, she managed to make her way up. There was a great many stumps where branches had withered off and the bark was nearly as rough as a hillside, so there was plenty of foothold for them. When they had climbed a long time and were getting very tired indeed, Alice cried out, "Richard, I shall drop, I shall. Why did you come this way?" And she began once more to cry. But at that moment Richard caught hold of a branch above his head and reaching down his other hand caught hold of Alice, and held her till she recovered a little. In a few minutes more they reached the fork of the tree and there sat and rested. "This is capital," said Richard cheerily. "What is?" said Alice sulkily. "Why, we have room to rest, and there's no hurry for a minute or two. I'm tired." "You selfish creature," said Alice. "If you're tired, then what must I be?" "Tired too," answered Richard. "But we've got on bravely, and look, what's that?" By this time the day was gone, and the night was so near that in the shadows of the tree all the dusky was dusky and dim. But there was still light enough to discover that in a niche of the tree sat a huge horned owl, with green spectacles on his beak and a book in one foot. He took no heed of the intruders, but kept muttering to himself. And what do you think the owl was saying? I will tell you. He was talking about the book that he held upside down in his foot. "Stupid book, this. Nothing in it at all. Everything upside down. Stupid ass. Says owls can't read. I can read backwards." "I think that's the goblin again," said Richard in a whisper. "However, if you ask a plain question, he must give a plain answer, for they are not allowed to tell downright lies in fairyland." "Don't ask him, Richard. You know you gave him a dreadful blow." "I gave him what he deserved, and he owes me the same. Hello! Which is the way out?" He wouldn't say, "If you please," because then it would not have been a plain question. "Downstairs," hissed the owl, without ever lifting his eyes from the book, which all the time he read upside down, so learned was he. "On your honor, as a respectable old owl?" asked Richard. "No," hissed the owl, and Richard was almost sure that he was not really an owl, so he stood staring at him for a few moments, when all at once, without lifting his eyes from the book, the owl said, "I will sing a song," and began. "Nobody knows the world but me. When they're all in bed, I sit up to see. I'm a better student than students all, for I never read till the darkness fall. And I never read without my glasses, and that is how my wisdom passes. Halloo, 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 halloo. I can see the wind, now who can do that? I see the dreams that he has in his hat. I see him snorting there as he goes, out as his stupid old trumpet knows. 10,000 things that you couldn't think, I write them all down with pen and ink. Hulu, ha ha, hula, wit, wit, that's wit. You may call it learning, 'tis mother's wit. No one else sees the lady moon sit on the sea, her nest all night but the owl, hatching the boats with the long-legged fowl. When the oysters gap to sing by rote, she crams a paw down each stupid throat. Halloo it, that wit, that fowl." And so singing, he threw the book in Richard's face, spread out his great, silent, soft wings, and sped away in the depths of the tree. When the book struck Richard, he found that it was only a lump of wet moss. While taking to the owl, he had spied a hollow behind one of the branches. Judging this to be the way the owl meant, he went to see and found a rude, ill-defined staircase going down into the very heart of the trunk. But so large was the tree that this could not have hurt it in the least. Down the stair, then, Richard scrambled as best as he could, followed by Alice. Not of her own will, she gave him clearly to understand, but because she could do no better. Down, down they went, slipping and falling sometimes, but never very far, because the stair went round and round. It caught Richard when he slipped, and he caught Alice when she did. They had begun to fear that there was no end to the stair. It went round and round so steadily, when, creeping through a crack, they found themselves in a great hall, supported by thousands of pillars of grey stone. Where the little light came from they could not tell. This hall they began to cross in a straight line, hoping to reach one side and intending to walk along it till they came to some opening. They kept straight by going from pillar to pillar, as they had done before the trees. Any honest plain fairy will do in fairyland if you only stick to it. And no plan will do if you do not stick to it. So in this next bit, what is so much fun and so very interesting and a little bit like, Alice, why are you such a snob, is the class, the notion of class that's present in this story. How Alice is kind of like, don't sit so close to me, and even has the gall to say something like, how did Richard get here? This is fairyland, like, does just anyone get in? And when she sort of asks him, and he says, a goblin brought me here, and she's like, oh, well, that makes sense, a fairy brought me. Because even in fairyland there's a sense of hierarchy, there's fairies and goblins are certainly down below. But yeah, Alice's disdain for Richard, that he dare sit so close to her, and after he helps her, he beats away the goblin, he does all these things to kind of help and save her, sort of, and she still is just very, has to maintain, the difference in their class, and that's so very interesting. And then what happens later, of course, is just the perfect, irony for her disdain that Richard should have come, someone from a lower class, is because, the irony sits in that because Richard is of the lower class, he knows what she doesn't. Because it would have been, and it often is in fairy tales, it is the people who know the stories of the fairies. They know the folk tales, where the people who are of the nobility or an upper class wouldn't know those stories because they're peasant superstitions. So Richard is the one who is able to help in fairyland because he knows when they see the owl, who he suspects is the goblin, just sort of shape-shifting, even that he would know the goblin he's just changed his shape, has changed his form. He knows the laws of fairyland, that if you ask somebody a simple question, I think he calls it, or a straight question, that they can't lie about it. And so, even if they'd like to. And Alice doesn't know this. And so it's very interesting, this section, how you see this sort of overturning, this kind of ironic point in which Alice is so, perturbed that Richard could have come, this person from a lower status could have come. But it's because someone of another class has come that they're going to start to make their way out of fairyland. So on one hand, it's sort of, Alice is such a jerk, but you're thankful that Richard is there. That's the end of part 3. For the next and final part, check out part 4 of George MacDonald's Cross Purposes. I almost forgot the title. Cross Purposes. Cheers, guys.